Hey, a lot of people on the Reddit poker sub, when polled, said what they struggled with the most were three bet pots out of position, which makes some sense. They are tricky to play. You know, you're in a big pot and you don't have position. It's a stressful spot to be in. Um, so I thought I would go over a couple of tips and tricks for playing three bet pots. Now, one really important thing to keep in mind, of course, is that there's a huge difference between playing three bet pots out of position where you're the preflop raiser versus three bet pots where you're the preflop caller. Um, and three bet pots where you're the preflop caller, they're by far the toughest of the two in the sense that, in general, people make less mistakes when they're in position and they have range advantage. I'll make a video about that spot some other time, but suffice it to say for now, it sucks. It's a crappy spot to be in. Just think of it as like you got a really good price to call versus their smaller three bet, right? And as a result of that, it's okay to lose the pot a lot. It's okay to play defensively, and you also want to keep in mind that if they three bet to a larger size, like they three bet 4x or 4.5x, you're going to be in a really crappy spot when you call. So like you're going to play really, really tight versus those larger races. Um, so a couple of things to keep in mind. I just wanted to start with like a kind of thought experiment for a second. Let's imagine you have, um, we're going to use really exaggerated examples for a second here. Let's imagine that you three bet and you have 10,000 combos of trash and you have one combo of the nuts, okay? And your opponent more or less knows this. I guess just imagine that they play with you for 100 billion hands and they just kind of get a sense of this. What happens, right, if you just give up with all of your crap and then 1 in 10,000 times you bet because you have the nuts? Obviously, your opponent is going to just get to fold, right? So the question becomes, how would you make your range balanced in this spot so that your opponent isn't sure what to do when you bet, right? Would you bet 100 times or out of 10,000 or 1,000 times out of 10,000 or what, right? So take a second here and pause the video if you'd like and just think about this for a second. Imagine you have 10,000 combos of trash and one combo of the nuts on a flop, and you're trying to decide how to balance this range. Okay, so hopefully you've paused the video and thought about it for a second. So it's kind of a trick question because it's going to depend on a few things. Namely, how much are you betting and how much equity does your opponent's range have or does your opponent's individual hand have against the quote-unquote nuts, right? Like if it's top set on a wet board, they can have 38% equity versus your exact hand, so they're going to call they're going to call like all of their really good draws and such. But if we just kind of imagine for a second we're like on the river or something, there's no more draws, and just simplify this example for a second. Let's say that you bet pot, okay? So they're getting 2-1 on a call. That means that you're going to want to have the combo of the nuts twice, let's say. They have to win the pot 2 out of 3 times to make the call even, right? So 2 out of 3 times losing equals 0 EV if hero bets pot. Villain has 2-1 odds. Okay, hopefully that part makes sense. So this would mean that you would need to bet the nuts twice for every one time that you bet the bluff. So in other words, a bluff would be 1 out of 20,000 times, and then value would be 1 out of 10,000 times, right? So why are we going through this experiment? Well, we're going through this experiment because you'll notice that given how infrequently you have a hand that wants to bet, right? ultimately, the amount of betting, both with bluffs and with value, is extremely, extremely rare, right? And so you want to keep this in mind when you look at the various kinds of flops that you face. I think that a lot of players, I mean, I used to have the problem of I have range advantage. I like it when people fold. So I'm just going to go bet, bet, bet and, hope that they fold. This doesn't work that well, especially if players are going to start getting a sense of how you play. And so you're going to want to have a strategy that accounts for the fact that checking is just going to be part of what you have to do. You might not have 10,000 combos of trash, but you're going to have a lot of hands that don't want to go for 3 streets of value, just want to give up, etc. And so those hands definitely want to check. And as a result of that, some of your straight draws and your gut shots and your flush draws and your overcards, they're going to have to end up in a checking range as well. Now, if we reverse this example and we said that, you have the nuts 10,000 times and then 1 out of every 10,000 times you had trash, right? This is a spot where you have to basically bet with everything. And, you almost, in a way, it's like you wish you had more trash, or you could take your trash to some other part of the game and put it here because your opponent's just going to fold everything, right? This 1 in a 10,000 times that they're going to be winning. So let's just look at this for a second here. One thing that I want to show you is just to give you a sense of why this spot is so tough, in terms of mathematically. If we look at this board, small blind is 3-bet, right? And button is called. Small blind actually has more equity than... Maybe let's look at a different example here. Oh no, this example is fine. So small blind actually has more equity than the button's calling range. Small blind has 55% equity. It's got the aces and the ace-king suited and whatever. And then button only has 45% equity. But look what happens to the equity realization, right? Small blind only gets to realize 92% of its equity. Why is that the case? It's because sometimes when you have pocket eights here, right, you check, they bet, and you just end up folding, and you didn't get to see whether or not you'd spike a set, right? So this is, or maybe your hand was ahead. So this is why small blind doesn't get to realize all of its equity. Button, on the other hand, has 105% equity realization almost, which means that they fold out enough hands that they end up with more equity than what would have happened if you just all went all in every time on this flop. Okay, so the other thing that I want to look at on this flop is I want you to notice something about where the equity advantage is for small blind, right? So you can see here at the bottom of the range, the absolute worst hands we can have, like here in the bottom 24% of range or whatever, the button has king 10 of diamonds. That's really sad on this flop, and queen jack off for the small blind, right? At the top of range, right, button can have top set, small blind can have, button can have middle set, small blind can have top set. All the money's getting in here, right? Where small blind has the most advantage is when they just have a really average hand, right? Like pocket kings on this flop, okay? Not an amazing flop for pocket kings, obviously, right? But not a terrible hand either, right? Unless they spiked an ace, you're ahead. So you'll notice that at this percentage in the range, the kind of middle tier of the range, small blind's beating button, right? This kind of thin value / bluff catchery portion of the range, button has tens, small blind has kings, right? Or, small blind has jacks, button has eights as we go down the range, queens versus middle pair, right? And this is what incentivizes small blind to use this smaller size. It's a size that says, hey, it's a size that's designed to say, you have pocket tens, I have pocket kings. Let's play a small civilized pot where I beat you for a little bit, and then we'll move on with our lives. Now, would you want to bet a larger size if you had pocket nines here? Yeah, you probably would. You'd want to just like pile in the money, or you'd want to start betting large on the turn. In fact, basically as a general rule, if you could get away with it, you want to bet big with your good hands, right? Um, but the thing is that if you bet big with your pocket nines and your ace king here and whatever else, and you bet small with your middle pairs and your pocket queens, then what happens to the range that bets small, right? It's a range that your opponent can run over. So what happens is if you see that the middle portion of the range is where the equity advantage is, what's going to tend to happen is that you're going to see a small bet. If you look at a flop like, let's say, ace jack 5, there's a slightly stronger advantage here for the small blind, slightly less equity for the button. You'll see that, the equity realization is flattened out a little bit. And we start to see like a little bit more of a pronounced range for the small blind versus the button. Like the best hands for the small blind are kind of beating the button a little bit more often. You start to see the big bet go up. If we look at a flop like King 7 deuce, what you'll see is that small blind is beating button not just in the middle of the range, but also at the top of range. And that means that it can bet either size, right? Like it's putting so many hands in a tough spot at the top of range, and it's putting hands in a tough spot in the middle of range, and basically everything you do here is good. I think that if you're really starting out and you're just not sure how to play these 3-bet pots after raising, one thing to keep in mind is that with exceptions like this King 7 deuce board and so on, let's look at like ace queen 5. What you'll notice is on the vast majority of flops, it's never that bad to check. Like every hand in your range is checking at some frequency on the majority of flops you'll look at, especially if you see a flop like 5-4-3, say, right? Now you see 64% check. I think we can do better than that, even like a 7-5-3. Okay, so there's still some bets for the small blind. But yeah, so these type of flops, you never make too big a mistake by checking. And what happens if you check, and in fact, especially if you decide that you're going to play a strategy where you check range, you have to get used to the idea of check raising, right? Here it's 1 in 5 times on this board. After the small blind checks and the button bets small, you throw in the raise. So what do you want to raise with? I mean, when you're starting out, the simplest thing to raise with is equity. So the more outs you have, the better. If you have like a straight draw or a flush draw, those are good hands to raise with. Ace king, not very good in the sense that like often your outs to an ace or a king don't get you there. So yeah, I would just recommend check raising your, if you decide that you want to play a strategy where you just check everything, then start raising like half the time with your straight draws and your flush draws and stuff. And then you can balance that by also having, your hands like pocket kings here, right? Or your hands like aces, the check raise and then try to jam the turn. But yeah, I think just like one useful tip is that it's never too bad to check the flop after you've been the 3-bet raiser. And also, this is like a little bit more complicated, but you just want to start thinking about what the best hand they can have in the situation is, what the best hand you can have in the situation is, and how many hands do they have that are kind of in the middle. They have a lot of hands that are in the middle, you beat a lot of their small hands in the middle, then you get to bet small often because you guys both have a lot of middling hands. And if instead, infrequently, but some chunk of the time, you have like the absolute nuts, and infrequently, but some small chunk of the time, they have like the second, third, fourth nuts, then that's a spot where you might check a lot, but when you do bet, you bet really big. And you say, hey, I've got 2 pair here. Hey, I've got ace, king, top pair, top kicker on like ace, 2, 3. And in those spots, again, still not terrible to check. The thing is also spots where small blind is just betting small with range, like ace 9, 4, I think we were looking at. Just by the very nature of what a small bet is, let's say a small bet was like absolutely mandatory. It's really important to bet small here. It's still not that different from checking, right? Because it's putting very little money into the pot. And then the spots where, you're going to bet really big with the nuts like 40% of the time, you're checking a lot anyway. So I guess it depends on where you're at in your game and what you're comfortable thinking about. But the simplest thing I would say is start checking range and start check raising fairly aggressively. Try to find like a quarter of your hands to check raise. And then if you are more advanced, you might want to start thinking about where is your equity advantage? Is it in the middle of the range? Is it at the top of range? Or is it at both? Okay. So I hope that was a helpful video, and run good, everybody. Take care.